And now, from beyond our dimension, this is the JeffMara podcast. Here's Jeff.
My guest is William Peters, founder of the Shared Crossing Project and global leader in shared death studies and end-of-life phenomenon. He has developed methods to facilitate the shared death experience and to assist experiencers in meaningfully integrating their experiences. His work is informed by his 2 NDEs and a variety of shared crossings. William, thank you for joining me on the podcast, and welcome.
Thanks, Jeff. Really good to be here.
William, if you don't mind, I know that your work is in SDEs or shared death experiences, but can you briefly give us a little overview of what happened to you in your NDEs?
Certainly. Yeah. And I think it's important, to start with the NDEs, because I don't think I would have had the receptivity or openness to my shared death experiences, and certainly the subsequent clients that came to visit with me about their SDEs, if I had not had these kind of watershed NDEs that really opened my mind up to a whole nother reality, really. So going back to my first NDE, I was 17 years old, living a real upper middle class life in the Bay Area of San Francisco, and went up to visit a friend to go skiing at Lake Tahoe at Squaw Valley, a real well-known ski area. And just skiing in the one morning, I decided that I would get some speed, head down the mountain. At 17 years old, more speed the better. And I caught an edge. And that, in a skiing terms, that means that my skis crossed up a little bit and catapulted me. It happened so quickly, but as it was happening, I could see my world slowing down. Everything went into slow motion. So I was under a stress. I knew this was really not good. And so things started to slow down. I was catapulted into the air. I was in the air for what seemed like a long time, which was exhilarating, but also I knew it wasn't going to have a good ending. And when I hit the ground, I somersaulted and crushed my spine. And at that moment, I felt a crunch and in my lumbar region, and everything went dark. It was almost like, if you remember the old MASH TV episodes when they would get bombed, and then the energy would kind of come out of the operating theater. It would go zzz, and it would just go blank and dark. Well, that's what happened to me. Everything just went dark, except I had an observer there. There was a part of me that was observing this. I was completely out of my body in any sensorial sense. I didn't feel any pain. I didn't feel anything. I had no sensory anything in that moment. Then my next sensation was that of seeing. I was above my body for a moment still, but then I started moving away quickly and I accelerated. And this was, in a certain sense, strangely familiar only in the sense that, oh, okay, I'm here, or this is what's happening. Not that I was like, this happens all the time, but it wasn't like, wow, what's happening here? It was more like I was, thrilled in a certain way to be moving away from my body, enamored by beautiful Lake Tahoe, the Sierra Nevadas, then the San Francisco Bay Area, Colorado Rockies, continental North America. Then eventually I had a satellite view, and it was all beautiful and enthralling and sublime feelings. But like I said, not unfamiliar. It was, I think a correct expression of this would be, I'd been here before. Like somehow, somewhere, I knew this perspective. As I was moving away, I noticed, oh, there's a review of my life going on. And I became, rather than being focused on the visual aspects of this, as I entered into these heavenly realms, I was, kind of going back and forth between these snippets of my life that were quite profound. And most of them had to do with experiences in which I had, they were usually pretty relational, like I'd done something to cause somebody harm, or there was some sort of conflict. It was kind of about unfinished business in my first 17 years of my life. And I really got the ripple effect of our actions and my thoughts. Like I can remember one kind of seemingly silly example. I was like 7 years old and I ran my bike into my neighbor friend on his big wheel, and he got, he started crying and ran inside. He cried to his mother. Then his mother got upset and yelled at the husband, and the husband did. The ripple effect of this kind of, I saw how actions matter, and this is karma. So it was a kind of profound teaching. But I was still moving away from planet Earth. In fact, at this point, I couldn't even see planet Earth, but I was in this tunnel. It was kind of a milky, white, slinky tunnel that I could see through into the beautiful galaxy. But eventually, I saw this pinprick of light, and I got fascinated on that. And the light started to grow as I was moving closer to it. But then I realized I'm dying. And unlike most near-death experiencers, I did not want to die. I was like, oh no, God, don't let me die. Do not let me die. I don't want to die. And I don't know where these insights came from, but they came with such emotional force, if you will. And I felt like, I had a relationship with this light, that I could actually call out to that light and make pleas that I thought might be heard. I went right into the light, and the feelings were sublime, and I was at peace, and I was in awe of all that I was experiencing. And even my desires to return to my life were lessening. But then as I hung out in the light, I felt this pushback on me. And I started moving very slowly away from that light. And I'm thinking, oh, I must be going back. And I had this sense of, I'm returning to my human life. And I said, thank you. Thank you, God. Now, I grew up Catholic, so for me, this light was God. There was no doubt about that. And the light, or God, if you will, said, make something of your life. Now, I didn't hear that in any verbal, oral tonnage. It was more, that's what I telepathically received. And it was quite strong. It was actually created a bit of cognitive dissonance for me. Like, I don't, what does he really mean by that? So I've spent a good deal of my life kind of working with, what does it mean to make meaning, make something of your life, make meaning of your life. That's kind of how I've interpreted it. So I spun back to, and I just say kind of spun back to my body. I didn't know how I was going to get back, but then all of a sudden I realized, oh, wait a minute, there's a force that's pulling me back somewhere. So I just trusted it. And I ended up seeing, played the whole tape in reverse, if you will. Eventually I saw planet Earth. Then I saw, continental US or North America. And I thought, wow, how am I going to get back into that body? How is it going to find myself here? And then once again, that was just some part of my mind doubting the authority, if you will, of what was happening here. And eventually I was back in my body, and I landed thump into my body, but I didn't have any feeling. And I said, God, don't let me be paralyzed. So I pleaded again with God. And then I felt feeling come over my body, which was quite a relief. And I remember relaxing, saying, thank you. But now as I look back on that time, I wish I had asked that I not have the physical effects of a severe spinal injury, which I've dealt with for now over 4 decades. So yeah, that was my first near-death experience. And I know that you, Jeff, and your audience are pretty astute and familiar with these. So it's fair to say this was a classic near-death experience in terms of phenomena.
Mm-hmm. You said that you grew up Catholic. Are you still Catholic today?
That's a great question. And my first response is, I think there are a lot of definitions about what it might be to be Christian, Catholic, or to be in any faith of that matter. What I can say is that I've become much more spiritual. That experience and others that I've had have opened me to the wide range, seemingly infinite ways in which we can connect with and know God or the divine, the holy, the sacred. So I'm very open to different traditions. In fact, I have a Buddhist practice that I picked up in the late 90s. It's still a core meditative spiritual practice for me. I'm moved by the teachings of Advaita Vedanta because I really like that big God that's in relationship with us, and the search for the divine that is kind of the hallmark of various Hindu traditions and practices. The Tao has always been interesting to me. It's kind of like that unmoved mover that we get in relationship to, and it's a benevolent, wise force that we can in some ways know but never really know. So and I love indigenous practices. I lived in Central and South America and Peru and Guatemala, and I was very influenced by indigenous practices and their way of relating to the natural world and the cosmos. So the parts of Catholicism that really resonate with me today and still do is the mystical tradition. There is a deep mystical tradition within Catholicism and Christianity, and I love, The Cloud of Unknowing is a great text that I go through and just go, wow, whoever wrote this got this. They really got the mystical nature of being a human being and what's possible in this human experience. There are others, Meister Eckhart and Teresa of Avila, and there's so many mystics, most of whom were kind of either excommunicated or on the outs with the mainstream church during their life, but later were brought back in as their experiences were reinterpreted and accepted as divine experiences and worthy of all of us within Catholicism and Christianity to honor and learn from. So I'm happy. Yeah, so I'd say, that's a long-winded answer to your question, response to it. But yeah, I think I'm that type of a Catholic. I'm a mystical Catholic.
I guess you're also a student of the Jedi Order.
I think that would fit. Yeah.
Just by seeing, if no one noticed, the Yoda statue behind you.
I love Yoda.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what I love about Yoda is Yoda's personality in a certain way, the way that he holds his wisdom with such a humility and reverence and soft-spoken and but ever so powerful.
So I said you had 2 NDEs. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. Yes.
What happened on your second one?
So about 13 years later, I contracted a rare blood disease, and it's called idiopathic thrombocytopenia. Mm-hmm. It is a low platelet condition, a kind of hemophiliac type situation where I was in danger of essentially bleeding out, and I couldn't clot. So, and they don't know why this happened, which is also somewhat mysterious. I mean, I was on some, a medication that could have contributed to it, but still my response was really extreme. So what happened was I went into, I noticed that I had dots, what they call petechiae, on my skin. And it was my skin started splotching. In other words, it looked like what was happening was blood vessels were bursting, and you could see the red come up in pinpricks through on top of my skin. And I was like, wow, what's going on here? So I was getting dressed. I looked at my hands and realized what's going on here. And then all of a sudden I realized it was all over my body. And so I called a trusted friend who's in the medical profession, and he said, you got to go to the ER right away. I go, okay. And what's interesting is had I not gone to the ER, I would not be here today. I would have just sanguinated to death. So I went to the ER, and within minutes I was in a room with a fall alert on, and I realized they were kind of concerned about me, but they didn't really know what to do. And the next thing I remember, this was in the afternoon on a Sunday or something, and I woke up in the middle of the night on top of what is the ICU in Kaiser Hospital, Oakland. I was at the top of just below the ceiling. And I think my first impressions were listening to nurses talk, kind of, once again, comfortable, at ease, a free-form consciousness moving about the top of the ICU. And I was going down the hallway. I saw janitors, working in the middle of the night, going into the closet, and just kind of observing. And I was most interested in this one room, which is where I was located in a bed, but I didn't even realize I was there. At least I didn't really make the connection. I should say physically there. I knew I was there in terms of my consciousness. But when the nurses started talking about, they were talking about the different people. And I remember them saying, oh, the person in bed 1, he's in a real bad way. He's 80 plus, heart attack, not likely to make it through the night. I thought, wow, I went over and looked at him and I go, yeah, he's not looking good at all. And then the person in bed 2 was an elderly woman, and she'd had some complications and she was in deep trouble. And then they go, there's this guy in bed 3, 30 years old, really just been in here for, sees one of our orthopedic doctors for some back stuff and some knee stuff, but really healthy guy. We don't know what's going on with him. And I thought, that's strange. So I went over to look at that guy, and then I looked at the guy and I realized, oh my gosh, that's me. That's me in that bed. And I was like, whoa, what am I doing there? And then I said, wait a minute, I'm up here. And then there's this me down there. And in that moment, I had this huge epiphany, and it just sounds like this: whatever I identify as me or I or myself is not dependent on that physical body, which was under a great deal of distress in that bed in the ICU. But I didn't hang out there very long. I thought, okay, that's fine. And I started moving around again and just enjoying my time up there. It wasn't until the doctor came in and tapped on my hand and said, Mr. Peters, Mr. Peters. And I responded from above. I didn't respond to him. I was kind of realized that he was talking to me. And he said, he announced his name as a specialist from UC San Francisco, and that I'd been diagnosed with this idiopathic thrombocytopenia, and he was an expert in that, and I was going to be in good hands, and I was on aminogamma-globulin and prednisone, and he was trying to get my attention because, and then he said, can I ask you some questions? And I was thinking to myself, well, how can I respond? What if I don't know how am I going to respond? What if I start talking? I mean, I was all like, do I want to go back into that body? How would I get back into that body? And then all of a sudden I just said one word and I was like, yes. And when I said yes, I started filling in my body. I literally, like sand in an hourglass, I could feel energetically different parts of my body start to fill with vitality and aliveness and sensation. But I was exhausted when I looked at him. Oh, that's the other thing. My view of the doctor changed from looking at his bald spot on his head and his white coat from behind or on top to now looking right into his eyes and realizing that he had spectacles on. And so I didn't have much of a conversation. I was too tired. But he did do something very interesting. He walked away from the bed, and then I noticed that he stopped and he turned around, almost like if you remember the old Columbo TV shows, he kind of put his hand up behind him and did a 180 and head back to my bed. And I thought, oh God, well, now what's he going to say? And he said, well, Mr. Peters, I think you should know something. And I just gave an expression with my eyes. I was too tired to speak. I kind of, got my eyes open, and he said, most people would have died with the low level of platelets that you have. And he said, so I just thought you'd want to know that. And I kind of said, oh, that's interesting. But I didn't make much of it. But it was something I remember. So those are my first two NDEs, Jeff.
During your second one, did you have any recollection of the first one and thought, oh, I'm here again, or I'm out of my body again?
Boy, let me think of that. No, I don't have any recollection of the first NDE specifically. But what I do have, I think, is a sense of comfort. I was not shocked or weirded out by that experience. I was there and it was like, oh, here I am again. So, but I think that may have to do with something else, conjecture, and that is that I think all of us as human beings, but I'll speak for myself, but I do think this applies to many of us, maybe not all of us, many of us, can access past experiences of our soul, spirit, consciousness when we're out of a body. So, these are pretty state-specific experiences. So I find that when I'm in that out-of-body experience, my response is, oh, here I am again. And it may not even be, oh, here I am again. It may just be that I'm there. There's no time. It's not like, it's just like, oh, like I'm just, that space of being out of a human body is probably, at least for me, I know when I get into it, because I have had them with shared death experiences as well, that I'm there again. And it's natural for me. So I don't even have an experience oftentimes of saying in my own mind, oh, I'm having an out-of-body experience. Like, in other words, the context of being a human being or having a human life can be absent. In other words, this reality of being out of body seems to be an existence of its own that may be going on all the time. I tap into it. I don't know. This is the notion of parallel universes and things like that. But yeah, to answer your question, I don't think so.
After either one of your NDEs, did you notice any cognitive changes that could be considered psychic?
Good question. And it's actually a research question for us, because that we do hear a lot of our interviewees in our research project. They say that they've become more spiritual and less religious, and they'll talk about certain intuitive capacities or the developed or psychic abilities, as you said. In my case, I would say that yes, I don't know what my life was intuitively, psychically before I was 17. I don't think I was living in that aspect of myself as a young person at that point. I will say, as a result of this experience, I have continued to develop a great intuitive ability. Yeah, definitely people who know me would say psychic ability for sure. And, I'm the type of person that if somebody's dying, I will sense them and sometimes be visited by them or somehow meet them somewhere. This doesn't happen all the time, but I tend to have that, gift or capacity that I never chose. I've never tried to develop that. That's not to say that I meditate a lot. And I think that meditating cultivates this, this development of an observing self that is less tethered to a physical body, so to speak. So I think there's more latitude to experience other, states of being, if you will, dimensions of consciousness.
Are you aware of the medical condition called acquired Savant syndrome?
Why don't you explain it to me? I think it's going to come back to me if you do, because I think I don't want to go down a path, but go ahead, explain it to me.
Well, I'm not a neurologist, but
Yeah.
when you have an impact to your nervous system, Sometimes people will have this acquired savant syndrome where you can have amazing ability in mathematics, like you see in the movie Rain Man, where the guy spills a box of toothpicks and he says, "Oh, that's 253." Or you may have some ability in music. I've had so many near-death experiencers say that they've had these cognitive changes that I felt like it's kind of another subsection of this acquired savant syndrome, having these psychic-like abilities.
Yeah, I think you're on to something there. And I think that's in the literature too. I can't say for sure, but I have a recollection of one of our great NDE researchers, Bruce Grayson. He's actually pretty interested in terminal lucidity as well. Well, then now it's called a form of terminal lucidity sits under a larger umbrella of paradoxical lucidity. And that goes at what you're talking about is some sort of trauma that manifests or harvests an extraordinary cognitive ability or even psychic ability. And here's something interesting about that. Let me answer your question first there, Jeff.
Sure.
Yes, for sure. I've seen that in my own clinical practice. I'll give you a great example of this. A woman who came to me, she got in a severe car accident and she had a spiritual experience. And honestly, I can't remember if she had an NDE of sorts, but I think she did. Now that I'm remembering it, yeah, she actually was told she was going to go back to her human life. So yes. And that's, yeah, now I'm remembering it. She said she'd go back to her human life and she realized she had a serious accident. And she said, but I need to be able to take care of my family. And God, the source, said to her, I will give you a gift that you'll be able to support yourself with. And she goes, okay. Well, she comes back and all of a sudden she's having financial difficulties and she just starts praying and she just hears this word paint. She starts painting and she starts painting masterpieces. And her profession ended up being she could do pretty much anything, just like point, she could do it. So she became a person who just could paint anything, and she could take a masterpiece and paint it. And she did all these, so anyway, she became a commissioned painter. So I think that points to your that example, because you've got trauma there happening in a car accident, and she had a brain injury and she wasn't supposed to survive. She had an NDE, as I've defined. And I can tell you that, like, over the decades of doing my work here, I've had many NDE experiencers who, and even people who have had extreme trauma, will come back and say, it's funny, I might think I'm crazy, but since that accident or since that experience, I've had this ability to, a lot of times I hear precognition. That's a very common one, that I just know things that are going to happen in advance. And so, yes, there is something about this. And now circling back to Bruce Grayson and his team, because they did a white paper on paradoxical lucidity, they found very interesting findings. And that is, persons with savant syndrome or autism, severe autism, they would get high fevers and they would become more normal. So they literally had so what you see here is that there's some sort of trauma to the system that actually is regulating a lot of these these illnesses, or even working with psychic abilities. So there's a lot going on there, and it is a fascinating field. I think there's even some research that points to even severe physical maladies that can be healed by certain traumas. And I think the one they use the most is they studied is the high fever that can not so much, doesn't heal or cure, because the fever goes back down and the pathology, if you will, returns. But it is an interesting way to look at what happens when our body gets under stress. How does it regulate?
Mm-hmm. It sounds like that you gain the ability to sense when people are close to death or dying. Is that what got you into shared death experiences?
Yeah, good. Yeah, let me just kind of walk through this, because after my second NDE, I should say that well, okay, here's the other thing. I lived and worked in Central and South America in the late 80s, which was right after my first NDE. And well, in that time, there were civil wars going on in the countries that I was working in, which was Guatemala and later Peru. And so famine, death and dying, was just all around us. And I remember kind of being drawn into an altered state when I was with people who were ill or close to death. And I was fascinated by it. It was very inviting. And I didn't know what to do about it. I didn't even really talk about it, because at this point I was working with the Jesuit International Volunteers, a liberal arm of the Catholic Church. We're doing refugee work in distressed areas. And so, I did have one experience where somebody was run over, unfortunately, it looked like they were run over by a vehicle, and I ran out to be with them. It was at night. There were very few cars on the road, and this person was on the ground, and I started assisting them, doing the checking their pulse, eventually did CPR. And as I was doing that, I felt all these presences come up around me, above me. And I kept feeling this pull upwards, like, what is this? And then as I kind of was doing physically trying to help this individual, I had this sense of communication from them that was affirming, you're doing the right thing. It wasn't like I didn't hear that. It was just like this sense of, my world was very tunnel vision at this point. I was really focused on this guy, trying to help him, and save him, yeah, because he was under a great deal of stress. But I was also drawn up into this other world. And this would be a shared death experience, in the sense that this individual I was working with would eventually die in the coming days. But I was in some ways witnessing or accompanying or having contact with what appeared to be his spirit guides, or some benevolent, loving force that was there at this great time of stress for him. Now, this is his experience would actually be up for discussion of whether it was an SDE. I would say this is the very beginning stages of an SDE, where the spirit clan and comes down, the guides and the elevated beings who, in my research, I call this group or these entities the conductor. This is the force that manages the transition of a human soul, spirit, consciousness from a human body into an afterlife. And I felt like I was in contact with them, and they felt very much in control. They were very much at peace. They were thanking me. I had a relationship with them, but they weren't particularly interested in me. I could tell they were there for him. So there's an interest in death that began, for sure. And I would think that there's a gift, and my own way of thinking of this, because I had the near-death experience just a few years before. I think I was familiar with, through trauma, through a traumatic incident, I was familiar with this landscape, this geography, this sacred, common geography, shared geography, if you will, that all human beings will eventually travel through as they leave their human body and go into the next realm of existence. So I'm comfortable there, and probably more receptive to it, and maybe grooved in a certain way, since most of us, I think, as human beings, have natural boundaries that are harder, more constraining. I think those of us who have NDEs have blown out those boundaries in a certain way. We're more porous. our consciousness more naturally and more easily can go out of the confines of a human brain body, if you will. So I had that experience, and then after my second NDE, I had family members that were dying and was with them, and I noticed conversations they were having as they were moments before, before they were dying, days before they were dying, that seemed to be conversations with other beings, and I could feel those beings. So I was like, whoa, there's something on here. There's a thickness in the room that let me know that this room had other presences there, and I could sense them. And I even, took notes on conversations that I was hearing my, paternal grandmother having with her, deceased friends and perhaps relatives that I didn't know, but I took the notes down and took the names, and she was 93, took them to the elder in our family, my uncle, and he would said, oh my gosh, these are names of people in her life from, 30, 40, even 50 years before. And so he said, you got the names down right, and you got the conflict down, because she was kind of working some things out. So I got interested in this, and that's how I got into Zen Hospice work. I was training as a psychotherapist, and I joined Zen Hospice, now almost 25 years ago. And because I was fascinated by what happens around death and dying. And in Zen Hospice Project in San Francisco, very forward-thinking, progressive hospice. And my job as a volunteer, I wasn't working in a paid position. I was a volunteer, which was ideal, because my job was to sit at bedsides and be present and be affirming and help family members with whatever they had, or if the dying needed someone to talk to or had questions, just to be a loving, affirming presence. No theology, no cosmology, none of that. Just be present. Well, while I was there, early in my work there, on an afternoon, I was reading this, the Jack London's Call of the Wild to Ron, who was close to death. And I popped out of my body. I mean, I just popped out of my body, and I could see my body in the chair down below. I was still reading, and I could see Ron, prone. Now, Ron was unresponsive. He was in a, semi-comatose state. So I could see Ron there. I could see myself in the chair. And then I looked to my right, and there was Ron with me. And he had a huge smile. He had a huge face. That's all I remember, seeing a gigantic face that was just, radiating joy and happiness, as if to say, check this out, William, check this out. This is where I've been. And once again, I was comfortable being there. I was a little startled to see Ron there in such a big form. But it affirmed what I'd known before, which is, I am not dependent on my human body. So I would have many more experiences during my work at Zen Hospice, all of them different. None of them like this one, where I was suspended with Ron and communicating with Ron, but others, like the main features we see in a shared death experience, very similar to the NDE phenomena, but a different perspective, if you will. I think if you look at this afterlife dimension holographically, there's just different ways to experience it and have different points of viewing, vantage points. So, while I was at Zen Hospice, I would see the light change in the room. Often the walls or ceiling would disappear, and I'd be looking up into, or entering into, what we call the heavenly realms, which is also, a term that Raymond Moody used both in his research on NDEs and also in his research on SDEs. So there's so many commonalities. You can have past life reviews. I think that the key difference between an NDE and an SDE is that the NDE is so relational. In other words, over half of our cases, the caregiver, loved one, or healthcare provider will see the dying in their transition, in some state of their transition, and it's very relational. So they're typically in some sort of communication with the dying. And of course, you don't have that in the NDE because it's the dying who's having the direct experience. In the SDE, they're observing or being invited in or participating or accompanying or in some cases guiding the dying in this afterlife realm that is just as similarly defined as in the NDE, just, heavenly realms, brilliant, hyper alive, blissful feelings, sublime, joy, understand everything, increased knowledge, oneness, unity experiences, all the, coding points that phenomenologically and features that we look for in the NDE. About 80% of them are in the NDE, so they're common points. So your viewers would be quite familiar with the shared death experience phenomena through their knowledge of the NDE phenomena.
If someone came to you and asked you what are the most important things that they could do to prepare for the death of a loved one and potentially increase the likelihood of having an SDE, what guidance would you give them?
Yes, great question, and one that is a central part of the Shared Crossing Project, because that is the most common request we get is, I have a loved one who's dying. I want to know how to prepare for it so I can be a good, loving caregiver, and I want to have the SDE if possible. So the first thing I suggest, and we have a whole program, but so if people are interested, it's a program called the Pathway Program, and you can go to our website and it's sharedcrossing.com and just take a look at it. But here's some of the key things to keep in mind. What we know about death and dying is when people have unfinished business, emotionally, relationally, those psychic, energetic experiences or unworked phenomena, you will, serve as weights or hooks for the dying, and they keep the person here in a certain way, and it's painful. This is you can see people. There's a type of writhing expression of pain that is what some people in the field call spiritual pain, and it's unfinished business. So the first thing I say to people is, if you want to have a good death, a graceful death, and you have the gift of knowing that either you or a loved one is dying, work things out with them. Do the things that we all know you need to do, which is own your regrets, own the harmful experiences you may have had in your life, express a sense of, take responsibility, and ask for forgiveness, and then really kind of wade into that space of forgiving one another. So the sense of working through your unfinished business, then say thank you to the person for the life you've spent together. So expression of gratitude and appreciation. And when you can get to this place, a whole nother chapter opens up for you in the last part of your life, or your life with this loved one who's dying. And in this space, you can work with staying connected into the afterlife. And that's where the protocols that I have developed over the last decade are about how it is when you're transitioning. Like, so if the dying person's obviously the one who's going to be transitioning. What is it? I teach how it is that dying person can see the signs in the landscape and remember to call back to their surviving loved ones, to bring them back, to bring them with them into the initial stages of the afterlife. Now, Jeff, it's too much to go into the details there. But the one thing I can tell your listeners is, if you can work on your consciousness, and if you can tell your surviving loved ones or soon to be surviving loved ones that you want them to be ready for your call, that you're going to try and maintain your consciousness through this death, and remember to go to them after they've left their human body and into this next afterlife dimension, and bring their surviving loved ones with them. If you can have that conversation, that tends to help significantly. You can even talk about signs that you want to show, that the dying would show to the surviving loved ones, and that can be all sorts of things. They seem to be able to flicker lights. I mean, the deceased, these disincarnate spirits are able to work with energy quite well. So lights and music and radios and, televisions and that type of thing, they seem to, be quite adept at working with. Now, I know this because in our research, I've created this spectrum of end-of-life experiences, because while I started out being a shared death experience researcher, all of a sudden, my interviewees would start sharing all these other phenomena that would happen post-death. So direct post-death communication and visions and visitations. These are all surviving loved ones that would come into my office and say, I know you worked with my dad when he was dying, and I didn't have a shared death experience with him that I can remember, but a few days after he died, I was shaving, and all of a sudden he appeared to me right in my bathroom. And I looked at him, I said, Dad. And he looked back and he said, yes, you can see that I'm alive and well. I love you. So we started tracking this phenomena as well. So, so this is how, we find that the methods and protocols that we teach to people does, in about, I would say, 3/4 of the cases, yield some sort of either shared death experience or after death communication. And we haven't done we're doing the formal research on that right now we're sending those questionnaires out to our now over 200 research participants to see if we can correlate this and demonstrate it. But I can tell anecdotally, almost everybody who does our trainings, and I do say almost everybody, not everybody, because a lot of them we lose track with, but it will say, oh my God, I had this. Oh my God, I had this. Or, you're going to think I'm crazy, but I was walking on the beach, and I walk on this beach every day. And I live in Santa Barbara, so walking on the beach is common here. And I was thinking about my, departed husband, and I said, send me a sign. And all of a sudden, I saw the biggest display, mammalian display of a whale, the wrong time of season, dolphins jumping up and putting on a performance for me. And I thought I was making this up in my mind, but other people walked up and said, have you ever seen this before? And anyway, so there's all these types of communication that I think, in the earlier days as a researcher, I would have been ashamed to state publicly, but now I quite brazenly state, look at the data. Look, we all can do probability and statistics to data on these experiences, and this is well beyond probability. There's something happening here. I'm not going to tell you what's happening here, but there's definitely something happening here. And I think we're seeing that with the research on psi and things like that. So I'm not alone in that. But as those of us kind of on the forward edge of looking at these extraordinary experiences and the question about, can the deceased communicate with us? I think the data is speaking to us quite clearly. There is something going on here that science, if we're going to listen to the science, is saying worthy of our attention, and definitely challenging traditional models of science.
You've recently published research on SDEs in medical journals. How has the mainstream scientific and medical community reacted to the stories of SDEs?
Great question, Jeff. And I can tell you that the journal article, the first one that you're referring to, that was really the watershed article in the American Journal of Hospice and Palliative Medicine, came out in December of 2021. It received immediate positive response from palliative and hospice care doctors and nurses in particular, who said, thank you for providing the research for experiences that I have seen throughout my, in this one case, this nurse said 3 decades of hospice care. It has got and continues to receive affirmation and gratitude from those who know about these experiences and are willing to talk about them. I also realize that, in the scientific medical community, these experiences are still unaccounted for in terms of an overarching philosophy or theoretical model that can explain them. So since they can't explain them, they don't have a model that can explain the shared death experience. The response was initially euphoria from a minority but vocal group of experienced hospice and palliative care providers, but still most of the mainstream has not said much. And I think that's because they don't see an upside in saying this, and this challenges the medical model. And the medical model, to be really clear, is brain creates consciousness. At the moment of death, with a dead brain, consciousness ceases to exist. There can be nothing more. These experiences, like the NDE, call into question the validity of that model, because clearly there's these experiences that are happening in the case of the NDE in persons who are deemed dead. In the case of the SDE, the shared death experiencer, a sound in mind and body, is having a relationship and communication with someone recently deceased. This can't happen. So we're at the front edge here. I do think that we're seeing changes. I mean, I can tell you, hospices are reaching out to me and my organization for more information, more training, because they, my point about this is a healthcare imperative that we let people know that these experiences happen, and that we cannot discount them, dismiss them, or disparage them, as some people in our research study have said that they had this experience in a hospital, and a healthcare provider dismissed the experience and said, you're under a great deal of stress. Why don't you, have a glass of water and get your wits back, which is quite demeaning to someone who's just had one of the most profound spiritual experiences of their life, and now realizes that their departing loved one not only is alive and well somewhere, but wants a relationship with them.
Why do you think science still clings to the premise that the brain creates consciousness?
I mean, I don't know. I think it's just so rooted in scientific materialism that it wants to see this world as a material reality that creates consciousness, rather than the reverse, which is it's consciousness that creates the material world. I think science feels it's got more control when it's a material world that creates consciousness than when it's a consciousness that creates a material world. If that's the case, then they got to get into consciousness, and that just basically threatens their whole endeavor, because a lot of scientists state, we're going to figure this out. We're going to figure this out, that everything is cause and effect in the material world. It's a mechanistic world we live in. And they want to believe that. And they've staked their whole career on it. So I don't understand it. I see a lot. I mean, I will say there are so many wonderful, open-hearted, brilliant scientists who are at least stating this model cannot account for so much of the human experience, and we need to take responsibility for that. We need to acknowledge this model is insufficient. Insufficient. That's the first step. When you realize the model you have is insufficient, you don't need to jump into a whole nother model, of consciousness as the driver of the universe, although I think that's probably the most likely one that we'd go towards. And not that we even understand consciousness, really, but at least we can gaze at that mystery and have a lot more honesty and integrity when we say the current model we have doesn't account for these experiences, and yet this other model that floats out here, that consciousness is the creator of at least our reality, our material human reality, seems to be more viable and explainable. So yeah, I can't. Yeah, that's my response, Jeff. Yeah.
What advice would you give to people who are grieving over a loss of a loved one?
That's such a thoughtful question, and I'll tell you why it is so thoughtful. Is because while I can get very excited about the shared death experiences and what it says about the human experience, first and foremost, I'm a psychotherapist who specializes in grief and bereavement around end of life, death and dying. And my primary reason for doing the research that I do is because the benefits to people who have these shared crossing experiences, the SDE and other experiences at the end of life, is that they know their loved one is alive and well, and that they'll be reunited. We see that in 89% of our cases. They express that they know, not just think, they know they'll be reunited with their loved one again. Their fear of death greatly diminishes, well over 50%. And we're doing, like I said, a new survey on that because we think it's higher. Their grief and bereavement is significantly different. It's better in a certain way. Doesn't mean they don't grieve the loss of their loved one if you have one of these shared crossing experiences. What it means is they hold the loss in a deeper understanding or context that sounds something like, it's so painful for me to have my significant other die and be gone from my life, and yet I know I'll see them again. And yet, so that becomes how they process, and they begin a type of there's a whole therapeutic grief and bereavement modality which I am a supporter of and practitioner in. It's called continuing bonds. And these end-of-life experiences, shared crossing, shared death experiences, after-death communication, visions, visitations, synchronicities, all of these experiences serve as communication between the dying and between the dead and the surviving loved one. And so when you start working with that phenomena, it gives an opportunity for the bereaved to craft a new relationship based on these experiences and others. And so the relationship continues, it evolves, it gets recrafted in a certain way. And so for those who are suffering from a loss, I encourage them to look for these signs. I encourage them to read the literature on that. I mean, there's a lot of wonderful literature out there about that's scientific, as well. But there's also good general public stuff that speaks to these experiences. I mean, there's not just my book, At Heaven's Door. There's wonderful after-death communication books. There's Hello from Heaven from Bill Guggenheim. That's a classic from the 70s. He's got, literally hundreds of cases from parents and from, spouses who have lost loved ones. And it supports this notion that while our loved ones are no longer in human form, they are somewhere else and there's a relationship to be had. So I do tell people that, death of a loved one is always going to be heartbreaking. And in some cases, you don't ever really get over. I don't like that language. You get over the loss of a loved one. I like the language that you have lost a loved one. It's painful. And now the invitation is, how can you, if you so desire, only if you so desire, how can you maintain a relationship of integrity that is not wishful thinking, that is based in the phenomena that you're experiencing, to recreate, if you will, or evolve a meaningful relationship with any of your departed loved ones.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned your book because I have to switch gears with you. It's titled At Heaven's Door: What Shared Journeys to the Afterlife Teach About Dying Well and Living Better. Do we find that on your website, on Amazon, or both?
It's my publisher is Simon & Schuster, so I have a wonderful publisher. They're everywhere. So Amazon's great. One thing I will suggest to your local readers, if they can go to a local bookstore, request it there. It's always wonderful to support our local book purveyors. They provide a culture for us that we don't want to lose. The ability to go into a bookstore and peruse and look what's out there. So yeah, you can get it pretty much anywhere.
All right.
You can go to my website too. If you go to my website, you can get on a mailing list if you're interested in that and get more information about other, offerings we have, me and my team have on shared crossings and things like that.
What are you working on that you want us to know about?
Well, there's, the research right now is focused on a survey, a quite in-depth survey of people. We have a control group, but the people we're most interested in are our past workshop participants, shared crossing workshop participants, and also those in our interview. And the questions we're looking for are, well, this is very interesting when you hear this. There is this force, I referred to it already, called the conductor. There seems to be a benevolent force in the SDE that is managing this relationship, or not relationship, well, the relationship too, but the relationship between the dying person and their transition into the afterlife. So the relationship is between the conductor and the dying. But there's some sort of relationship between the conductor and the shared death experiencer. And we're trying to figure out all about these relationships and the role of the conductor, because if we can figure out more about this, I have this hope, aspiration that we as caregiver loved ones can attune to the conductor who's manifesting this transition and be of service to the conductor to see if we can play roles to support a more graceful, loving end of life and transition for our loved ones. It's just a wonderful endeavor, if you will. So we're trying to figure out more about the conductor. And then we're also interested in pets. People have SDEs with pets. And so we're studying pets. And not so much studying pets, but we're studying these cases where people will talk about an SDE with a pet. So that's exciting. That's dogs and cats and horses, a lot of horses, birds. It's really something when you see somebody have an SDE and they see their, and I'm thinking of a case with a woman in New Zealand whose husband was dying, and all of a sudden she sees her husband, walking, kind of going out of the room where he's dying down a pasture, and all of a sudden she sees their dog, who's predeceased, greet him there. Well, that's spectacular. So you have those, and then you also have SDEs when a pet's dying and you go into the afterlife with the pet, and that's pretty spectacular. So we're interested in that. And then other things we're interested in are just the types of relationships. Like, is there any difference in the relationship between spouses and the SDE phenomena? And when you lose a child or lose a parent. So all of that we're interested in right now. And then the other thing I'll say, Jeff, is that if your viewers are interested, we used to be more of a brick and mortar provider of services. We still are. With COVID, we stopped doing our in-person programs, but this fall we're starting those up again. Those are in Santa Barbara. But our flagship program, the program that people are most interested in, is the Pathway program. And that's the program where we essentially teach people how to have the shared death experience and other shared crossing experiences. And that's really a 3-step program, which starts with normalizing these experiences, really letting people know that these experiences happen, and we teach them what these experiences are, what to expect when they happen. And then we do this preparation for a conscious, connected, and loving end-of-life experience, which is really addressing the unfinished business that I've already referred to. A lot of spiritual exercises, work with forgiveness, compassion, life reviews, and really stepping into joining our loved ones in acknowledging and accepting, as difficult as it is, that either one of the two, and if you're working with partners, you don't have to work with partners, but a lot of people do, that everyone you know and love is going to die. So it's good to get into relationships so you're not surprised by that. So that's kind of that preparation, which is a bit intense, but people really appreciate it because they feel like they don't have to be in denial anymore about the fact that, gosh, they know they're going to die and they know their loved ones are going to die. So let's talk honestly about it. So we do all that. We get into preparation with that. And the last part of the training is teaching the shared crossing protocols, which is how you stay connected with a loved one as they're dying across the threshold, and how you reach back, if you're the dying, to connect with your surviving loved ones. And we teach receptivity on the part of the surviving loved ones. How do you attune so that you can get those calls? So that's a rather in-depth training as well, but you can do it all in a weekend, and we're doing it online. And so for people who are interested, we have a workshop, I believe, coming up in November, and then that's online, and then in person would be in Santa Barbara in October. So yeah, there's those programs. And then the last one I'll say, for those who are mental health practitioners or end-of-life practitioners or spiritual care providers, starting a program for a consultation group so that we can work together with people who work in the various capacities of end-of-life to teach them the shared crossing paradigm, if you will, how you welcome these experiences, how you integrate them, how you work with clients and families. It's very exciting. And that'll be an international group because people have expressed interest from all over the world.
If people want to reach out to you and ask you questions, are you open to that?
Yeah, definitely. You can go reach out to info@sharedcrossing.com, info@sharedcrossing.com. We have a team here that does receive those. And when they're directly relevant to me, they come right to me. One other thing here, Jeff, if you've had an experience, any kind of shared crossing experience, we have ongoing research right now, and you can reach out to us. In fact, we're going to do another round of research, so this is a good time to submit a story if you've had one. Once again, that goes to info@sharedcrossing.com. And then, someone on our research team will likely reach out to you. You can also submit a story directly. That's the quickest way to get to us, is to go to our contact page, and you'll see, submit your story, and then our research team will get to you sooner. We do have interns as well that are working with us right now. So if you want to be an intern and work on our research side of things, you can send that to info@sharedcrossing.com too. And you can, see if we can place you in our intern program, because we have lots of wonderful people working with us in a variety of ways. Researchers, coders, people doing all sorts of listening in on interviews. It's all great. So a lot going on. And I know your audience would be interested in this.
William, before we finish up, can you leave us with one last positive message?
Well, the positive message is that, from what we know about death and dying and our research and around the world, the other researchers that work as closely as I do with this, is that death is not to be feared. That death is a journey into a benevolent afterlife that is far more joyous and connected. There's a sense of belonging that can deliver to us perhaps the deepest, most meaningful experience of us as eternal beings. And so I can say, with my sincerest, most integrous expression around what I know about death and dying, is that death is a beautiful, mysterious, marvelous event, and we should get into relationship so that we can give each other good deaths and maintain connection through this event and see each other all again.
William, thank you for that message, and thank you again for being my guest. I appreciate you, and I wish you success in all your work and research.
Thanks, Jeff. Pleasure to be here with you. I really appreciated this interview.
All right. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks for watching the JeffMara podcast. I really appreciate you. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. And if you do, there are loyalty badges and other perks depending on your level of membership. All you need to do is click the join button underneath the video to find out more. Thank you for your support.